the small hours before morning, when even the highway seems to hold its breath, Jordan Reyes used to wake up already bracing for the day. Not because the day was dangerous, not because something dramatic waited outside the door, but because the quiet had become heavy. The layoff had been clean and official. Emails, forms, a final badge scan, and then it was over. 1 week, Jordan had a schedule that made the world feel organized, and the next week there was a blank calendar, a quiet phone, and long afternoons that stretched like an empty road. Jordan tried to do everything the right way. Applications, follow-ups, certifications, refreshing job boards, like there might be a hidden door that only opened if you checked one more time. But what nobody tells you about starting over is this: the hardest part isn't the work. It's the silence that shows up when the work disappears. The silence doesn't shout. It just sits there, patient, waiting for you to decide what you believe about yourself when nobody is watching. One morning, gray, cold, and ordinary, Jordan noticed something strange. The shoes by the door were still the same shoes from the old routine. Sturdy, worn in, reliable. Shoes meant for moving. Jordan didn't make a grand plan. There was no dramatic vow, just a small decision made in a quiet kitchen. The kind of decision that looks insignificant from the outside, but changes everything from the inside. Jordan put on the shoes, pulled on a jacket, stepped out into the early air, sharp enough to sting, clean enough to wake the lungs up. At the edge of town, there was an old rail trail converted years ago into a walking path, a straight ribbon of pavement cutting through trees and brush, running past fields that turned gold in late summer. The trail had mile markers, simple posts with numbers, meant for runners and cyclists. Jordan hadn't thought about mile markers in years. Back when life was simpler, a mile meant something you could feel in your legs, count in your breath, celebrate without permission. The first day, Jordan walked to the first marker and back. That was it. No stopwatch, no goal, no victory speech. Just the sound of shoes on pavement and the steady rise and fall of breath. The second day, Jordan walked to the first marker and a little beyond. Only a few steps, the kind that barely registered. But those steps mattered in a way Jordan couldn't explain yet. By the end of the week, Jordan had started to notice small details, frost patterns on the edges of leaves, the way a crow's wings cut across a pale sky, the soft, persistent rhythm of the trail itself. Something else happened too, something quieter than motivation. Jordan began to feel less like a person waiting for life to restart, and more like a person already moving. It wasn't magic. Some mornings the body felt heavy, as if it had been filled with sand. Some mornings the mind tried to drag Jordan back into the old loop of worry. What if it doesn't work out? What if this is it? But the trail didn't argue. The mile marker didn't judge. It just waited, quietly insisting that progress could be simple. 2 weeks in, Jordan started carrying a small trash bag. At first it was practical. There was litter along the path, caught in brush and fence lines. But soon it became something else, a habit of taking responsibility for the world immediately around you, even when you can't control the bigger picture. The bag filled with things that didn't belong, bottles, wrappers, forgotten plastic. Jordan didn't post about it, didn't announce it. It wasn't a performance, it was practice. Practice at choosing action over despair. Practice at becoming trustworthy to yourself. As the weeks turned, winter tightened its grip. The wind cut harder. The sky felt lower. The trail, sometimes, looked lonely. And then came the storm. Overnight, the town disappeared beneath a heavy layer of snow and ice. Branches cracked under the weight. Power lines sagged. Streets turned into slow, careful lanes. The next morning, Jordan drove to the trailhead anyway. Not because it was logical, not because it was convenient, but because the trail had become a promise. The kind of promise that holds you up when everything else feels uncertain. The path was nearly empty. Snow muffled sound the way thick curtains muffle a room. Jordan walked slowly, each step measured, breath rising in pale clouds. Half a mile in, Jordan saw it. A tree down across the trail, trunk wide and heavy, branches tangled like a locked gate. For a long moment, Jordan just stood there. Not because the tree was surprising, but because it looked exactly like the feeling that had been living inside Jordan for months. Blocked, stuck, stopped short. Jordan could have turned around. Nobody would have known. Nobody would have blamed a person for walking away from a problem that big on a day that cold. But something in Jordan, something quiet and stubborn, refused to leave it there. The first attempt didn't move the trunk at all. Jordan tried again, shifting a branch, then another, finding leverage one small piece at a time. Gloves soaked through. Snow slid down the collar. Muscles burned. The cold tried to convince Jordan that effort was pointless. But the work wasn't really about the tree. It was about proving something simple and essential, that being blocked is not the same as being defeated. Branch by branch, the opening appeared. Not wide, not perfect, just enough for one person to pass. That winter, Jordan didn't land a dream job overnight. Some applications disappeared into silence. Some interviews went nowhere. Some days felt like starting over again and again. But each morning, Jordan put on the shoes. Each morning, Jordan returned to the trail. And slowly, almost without realizing it, Jordan became the kind of person who returns. Not because it's easy, but because it matters. When spring finally arrived, the snow retreated in patches, and the town seemed to exhale. The trail looked brighter. The mile markers stood clear again, like quiet witnesses. Jordan noticed a flyer at the trailhead about a community 5K, an event meant for everyone, not just athletes. Jordan didn't feel like a runner. Jordan didn't feel like a success story. Jordan still felt sometimes like a person in the middle of an unfinished chapter. But that's the thing about unfinished chapters. They are still being written. On the morning of the 5K, Jordan stood near the back, not hiding, just choosing a start that felt honest. There were people stretching, laughing, bouncing with energy. There were families, older walkers, younger runners, strollers, sneakers in every color. Jordan felt the old instinct to shrink, to believe that if you aren't the best, you don't belong. But the trail had already taught a different lesson. The lesson was simple. Belonging is not something you earn at the finish line. Belonging is something you claim the moment you decide to begin. The event started, and Jordan moved forward with the crowd. Not fast, not dramatic, just steady, one foot, then the other, breath lining up with effort. The first mile marker passed. Jordan felt the familiar tightening in the chest. Not pain, not fear, but awareness. Awareness that the body was working. Awareness that the mind was staying present. Awareness that this moment was real. The second mile marker arrived, and Jordan's legs grew heavy. The old doubts tried to rise again, the same ones that always show up when effort gets serious. But Jordan didn't negotiate with them. Jordan just kept moving. The third mile was quiet, not because the world was silent, but because something inside Jordan had finally stopped chasing proof. Proof had already been given. On the mornings when the calendar was empty, on the days when hope felt thin, on the winter morning when a fallen tree blocked the path and Jordan chose effort anyway. Jordan crossed the finish line, not as the first, not as the fastest, not as a headline, but as something far more powerful, a person who did not disappear from their own life. Afterward, Jordan walked along the trail again, slower now, letting the heartbeat settle. The mile markers stood in place the way they always had. Simple posts, plain numbers, no applause built into them. And yet they represented something Jordan finally understood. Change doesn't always arrive like a lightning stroke.